August 29, 1944. Somewhere on a dusty road in northern France, a column of German prisoners shuffles westward under American guard, their faces hollow with exhaustion and defeat. They pass an intersection where military police direct traffic, and what the prisoners see stops them cold. Stretching to the horizon in both directions, an endless river of trucks flows past. GMC 2.5-ton vehicles, painted olive drab, their canvas covers bulging with ammunition, fuel, rations, and medical supplies. The trucks roll by at 60-second intervals, 24 hours a day, and their engines growling in a constant mechanical chorus that never stops. One captured German soldier, his name lost to history, watches this spectacle for several minutes. Then he turns to his American guard and speaks words that would echo through military history for generations. "I know how you defeated us. You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." This was the Red Ball Express at its peak. 132 truck companies, nearly 6,000 vehicles. Over 12,000 tons of supplies delivered in a single day. And this was just one component of an American logistics system so vast, so overwhelming, that German commanders from field marshals to sergeants would spend years after the war trying to explain how it had crushed them. Not through superior tactics, not through better generals, but through the sheer, relentless, unstoppable flow of American supplies. The German word for it was Materialschlacht, the material battle. And in this war, they never stood a chance. To understand what the Americans built in Europe, you first have to understand the scale of what they were attempting. The United States Army in 1944 was not just an army. It was a fully motorized industrial machine, the only one of its kind among all the major powers fighting the war. While the German Wehrmacht still relied on approximately 2.75 million horses to move its supplies, the Americans had trucks, endless trucks. The country produced roughly 2.4 million military vehicles during the war, compared to Germany's 159,000. That ratio of 15-to-1 would define everything that followed. The heart of this system in Europe was the communications zone, commanded by Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee. His soldiers called him Jesus Christ himself, a sardonic reference to his initials and his reputation for self-importance. But whatever his personality, Lee's organization was indispensable. By early 1945, he controlled over 500,000 service troops, responsible for moving between 700,000 and 1 million separate categories of supplies. Everything from tank shells to toilet paper, from plasma to prophylactics, from boots to bulldozers. The American military calculated that each soldier in combat required approximately 100 pounds of supplies per day. Multiply that by the hundreds of thousands of men advancing across France, and you begin to grasp the magnitude of the challenge. Above Lee, in the command structure, sat Lieutenant General Brian Somervell, commanding the Army Service Forces from Washington. Somervell coordinated the flow of men and materiel from American factories to European battlefields, ensuring that production matched consumption and that ships sailed full in both directions. It was Somervell who insisted that logistics be treated not as a secondary concern, but as a war-winning weapon in its own right. The trucks that carried these supplies were themselves marvels of American industrial standardization. The GMCCCKW, nicknamed the Jimmy, was rated to carry 2.5 tons but routinely hauled 5. Over 560,000 of these vehicles rolled off American assembly lines during the war. They were tough, reliable, and most importantly, interchangeable. A mechanic who knew how to fix one Jimmy could fix any of them. Spare parts that fit a truck in Normandy would fit one in the Philippines. The Willys Jeep, produced in quantities exceeding 640,000 when Ford's production was included, became the universal utility vehicle of the Allied forces. Eisenhower himself called it one of the war's decisive weapons. The DUKW amphibious truck, over 21,000 built, could drive off a ship, swim to shore, and continue directly to a supply dump without ever stopping to unload. These vehicles formed the backbone of an army that moved on wheels while its enemies still moved on hooves. Behind these vehicles stood the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, approximately 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 87,000 naval vessels, and over 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant alone produced one B-24 bomber, every single hour, at its peak in 1944. At its height, the plant employed over 42,000 workers, operating in a facility that covered 80 acres under one roof. By 1944, American gross national product had grown 52% from its pre-war levels. The country had transformed itself into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, and that arsenal was now pointed directly at the heart of Nazi Germany. The men who operated this system came from every corner of American society, though not all of them received equal recognition for their service. The Red Ball Express, which became the most famous symbol of American logistics in Europe, was crewed predominantly by African American soldiers. Approximately three-quarters of the drivers in the European Theatre's motor transport service were from black units serving in a still segregated army, where they were overwhelmingly assigned to service roles while white officers commanded them. These men drove trucks for 36 hours at a stretch without sleep. They hauled supplies through mud, through rain, through the constant threat of German air attack. They maintained vehicles that were being pushed far beyond their design limits. In the first month of Red Ball operations alone, 40,000 tires wore out, engines overheated, transmissions gave out, and drive shafts simply fell off from the strain. Some drivers reportedly averaged 36 or more hours at the wheel without rest, pushing themselves to the edge of human endurance. Technical Sergeant Emmanuel Wilson Green of the 3989th Motor Transport Company remembered stepping over dead German soldiers at drop-off points. Private First Class Ernest Myers of the 3214th Quartermaster Service Company said the black soldiers wanted to make an impression for the people back home. Master Sergeant Alfonso Campbell of the 520th Quartermaster Group landed 10 days after D-Day and could still smell the stench of the dead. These were not the men who would appear in newsreels or receive medals in front of cheering crowds, but without them, the war could not have been won. A tank driver from the 5th Armored Division put it simply: if it was not for the Red Ball, we could not have moved. They all were black drivers, and they delivered in the heat of combat. John S. D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son and himself an army officer, wrote that the spectacular nature of the advance through France was due in as great a measure to the men who drove the Red Ball trucks as to those who drove the tanks. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a decisive turning point. The D-Day landings on June 6th had established a foothold in France, and now the Allies were breaking out from the Normandy beachhead. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, shattered German defences and sent American armour racing across France at speeds that exceeded everyone's expectations, including those of the American supply officers who were supposed to keep them fed and fueled. The original Allied logistics plan had anticipated reaching the Seine River by D+90, 90 days after the landings. Instead, American forces reached it in a matter of weeks. By late August, General George Patton's Third Army was racing east toward the German border with what seemed like unstoppable momentum. But there was a problem. The supply dumps were still in Normandy, 300 to 500 miles behind the front lines. The Germans had expected this. Their defensive strategy in France had assumed that even if the Allies broke through, they could not sustain a rapid advance. The distances were too great, the infrastructure too damaged, the consumption rates too high. A single American armored division required approximately 25,000 gallons of gasoline to move 100 miles. Patton had multiple divisions, and they were all running out of fuel at the same time. On August 31st, Patton reportedly exploded at a staff meeting. "I will shoot the next man who brings me food. Give us gasoline. We can eat our belts." This was the crisis that gave birth to the Red Ball Express. On the night of August 23, 1944, Brigadier General Ewart G. Plank, commander of the advance section, made a decision that would change the course of the war. "Let it never be said," he declared, "that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans could not." Within 36 hours, the Red Ball Express was operational. The concept was simple but unprecedented in scale. 2 parallel routes would be dedicated exclusively to supply traffic. The northern route carried loaded trucks heading east. The southern route carried empty trucks returning west. Both routes were closed to all civilian traffic and all other military vehicles. Military police guarded every intersection around the clock. Every truck displayed a red ball marker on its front and rear, the railroad term for a priority freight shipment that took precedence over all other traffic. The operation was planned in a 36-hour session by Lieutenant Colonel Loren Albert Ayers, nicknamed Little Patton by his men for his aggressive driving style, and Major Gordon K. Gravel from Communications Zone Headquarters. Colonel Clarence W. Richmond had already pooled 90 advanced section quartermaster truck companies before the Red Ball was formally established. These men worked around the clock to create something that had never existed before, a dedicated highway system for war. The operation launched on August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated. On its first day, 67 truck companies with 3,558 trucks hauled 4,482 tons of supplies. Within 5 days, the operation had grown to 132 companies with nearly 6,000 vehicles. By September 5th, the Red Ball had delivered 89,939 tons, exceeding its original goal of 75,000 to 82,000 tons. But success created its own problems. The routes kept extending as the armies advanced. What started as a 125-mile one-way trip grew to round trips of over 750 miles to First Army and 670 miles to Third Army. Trucks that were designed for depot-to-depot work were being driven continuously across roads that were never meant for such traffic. The vehicles consumed their own cargo. At extended distances exceeding 300 miles, a truck burned 40 to 50% of the fuel it was carrying just to make the delivery. The pressure on the drivers was relentless. Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, reported that men died with their hands on their wheels. Official speed limits were 25 miles per hour, with minimum convoy sizes of 20 vehicles and 60-yard spacing. In reality, drivers removed the governors from their engines and pushed their trucks to 60 and 70 miles per hour. A round trip took approximately 54 hours. Sleep was a luxury. Food was eaten on the move. Breakdowns were fixed on the spot, or the truck was pushed aside and left for recovery crews. The black market flourished in this chaos. A 5-gallon jerrycan of gasoline fetched $100 on the French black market, a fortune at the time. Approximately 2,000 trucks were reported stolen during the operation. Approximately 20,000 American soldiers were absent without leave in France by fall of 1944, many of them engaged in diverting supplies. Allied units sometimes hijacked Red Ball trucks out of desperation, knowing that their requisitions might take days to fill while the trucks were rolling past their positions loaded with exactly what they needed. Despite all of this, the system worked. Over its 81 days of operation from August 25 to November 13, 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,193 tons of supplies. It kept Patton's tanks moving until they quite literally ran dry at the German border, and when the Red Ball shut down, it was replaced by other express routes. The White Ball Express ran from Le Havre to Paris from October 6, 1944 to January 6, 1945. The ABC Express served the Antwerp-Brussels-Charleroi corridor from late November 1944 to late March 1945, delivering over 244,000 tons. The XYZ Express, the largest and most successful, delivered approximately 870,000 tons during the final drive into Germany. The Germans, watching all of this from the other side of the lines, had nothing that could compare. Their logistics system was breaking down at every level, strangled by problems that had been building since the war began. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, identified 3 factors that defeated his forces in a post-war interrogation. First, the unheard-of superiority of your air force, which made all movement in daytime impossible. Second, the lack of motor fuel, oil and gas, so that the panzers and even the Luftwaffe were unable to move. Third, the systematic destruction of all railway communications, so that it was impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. All 3 of von Rundstedt's factors were fundamentally logistics problems. The Allied air forces had achieved such complete dominance that German supply columns could only move at night, creeping along darkened roads while American and British bombers roamed overhead. Allied air superiority exceeded 5-1 in fighters, more than 5,000 Allied day fighters versus roughly 250 German. Lieutenant General Bodo Zimmermann, Chief Operations Officer for Army Group D, described D-Day conditions. The whole of the area through which the divisions must march was being most intensively patrolled by the Allied air forces. No road movement by day was possible. Every crossroads was under observation. The fuel shortage von Rundstedt mentioned was catastrophic. Germany's synthetic fuel production, which provided 92% of the Luftwaffe's aviation gasoline, peaked at 124,000 barrels per day from 25 plants in early 1944. After Allied bombing of oil targets began in May of that year, production collapsed. By February 1945, synthetic aviation gasoline output had fallen to just 1,000 tons, 0.5% of its peak levels. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, wrote that with the beginning of the Allied attack on oil centers, a new era in the air war began. It meant the end of German armaments production. Luftwaffe Field Marshal Erhard Milch stated that the British left us with deep and bleeding wounds, but the Americans stabbed us in the heart. The railways that von Rundstedt lamented had been systematically destroyed before D-Day as part of the Allied transportation plan. All bridges between Paris and Rouen were down by early June. The 17th Panzer Grenadier Division took 5 days to cover 200 miles. The SS Division Das Reich left Limoges on June 11th and did not reach Normandy until the end of the month, committing atrocities along the way at Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane, partly out of frustration at their inability to reach the front. Panzer Lehr Division lost 80 half-tracks, self-propelled guns, and prime movers on June 6th alone. Reinforcements that should have arrived in hours took weeks, and many never arrived at all. But the German logistics problems went deeper than Allied bombing. The Wehrmacht had never been the fully mechanized force that Nazi propaganda portrayed. Approximately 75 to 80% of German army transport was horse-drawn. The army employed roughly 2.75 million horses during the war, with over 1 million in active service at any given time. A 1943 German infantry division's supply train included only 256 trucks, alongside 2,652 horses, attended by over 4,000 men. Of 322 German divisions in November 1943, only 52 were armoured or motorized, just 16%. Horses died at a rate of approximately 1,000 per day on the Eastern Front alone, from combat, exhaustion, disease, and the brutal Russian winters. German soldiers captured in Normandy, watching the endless American trucks rolling off landing craft, asked their captors a question that revealed everything about the gap between the two armies. Where are the horses? The vehicle situation was equally dire. While Americans standardized on a few key vehicle types, the Germans operated what one historian called a ramshackle collection of captured vehicles from across occupied Europe. Maintaining this fleet was a nightmare. Spare parts for a French Renault truck were useless for a Czech Tatra or a captured Soviet ZIS. Each vehicle required its own supply chain, its own mechanics, and its own depot of parts that might or might not be available. General Hans Eberbach, commanding 5th Panzer Army in Normandy, reported his artillery included guns from every major power in Europe, creating an ammunition supply nightmare that defied solution. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had experienced American logistics firsthand in North Africa before his transfer to France, offered perhaps the most vivid testimony about what it meant to face such overwhelming material superiority. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, he wrote, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. Lieutenant General Johann von Ravenstein, captured during Operation Crusader in 1941, had summed up the desert campaign in similar terms. The Western Desert, he observed, may be the tactician's paradise, but it is the quartermaster's hell. In Normandy, just days before he was seriously wounded by strafing aircraft on July 17th, Rommel stated flatly, "The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There is simply no answer to it." He was right. There was no answer. General Friedrich von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff of the 5th Panzer Army, reached similar conclusions in his post-war memoir, Panzer Battles. The Ardennes battle drives home the lesson that a large-scale offensive by massed armor has no hope of success against an enemy who enjoys supreme command of the air. Throughout his book, von Mellenthin emphasized that American supply capabilities were overwhelming, while German forces were perpetually undersupplied, always short of fuel, always waiting for reinforcements that never came. Von Mellenthin had seen the contrast firsthand. German tank commanders rationed their fuel down to the last litre, calculating exactly how many kilometers they could travel before running dry. American tank commanders simply radioed for more gasoline and received it within hours. German artillery batteries counted each shell, knowing there might be no replacement. American batteries fired with abandon, confident that the supply trucks would arrive with more ammunition before the guns fell silent. This was not a fair fight. It was industrial warfare against improvised survival. The contrast between the two systems became starkest during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Hitler's Ardennes offensive was predicated on a desperate gamble. The German forces would capture Allied fuel to sustain their advance. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the attack, consisted of 4,800 men and over 800 vehicles, including Tiger II tanks that consumed 2 American gallons per mile. They had fuel for only 90 to 100 miles. Their objective, the Meuse River crossings, lay roughly 150 miles away through the difficult Ardennes terrain. The American response demonstrated everything that made their logistics system superior. On December 17th, Eisenhower ordered the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions forward. The 101st travelled over 100 miles in open trucks through freezing weather to Bastogne, arriving 4 hours ahead of the leading German forces. The trucks that carried them were available because the American system had depth and flexibility. There were always more trucks. At the December 19th conference at Verdun, General Patton stunned the assembled commanders by announcing he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. This was not bravado. Patton had pre-positioned his logistics to allow for exactly this kind of rapid redeployment. His staff had already prepared 3 contingency plans for different attack directions. He picked up the phone, said 2 words, "Play ball," and activated the operational orders for a northward attack. What followed was one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the war. Patton's Third Army disengaged from the Saar front, wheeled 90 degrees north, and advanced over 100 miles on icy roads to relieve Bastogne. The counterattack launched on December 22nd, just 3 days after the Verdun conference. Over 133,000 vehicles were rerouted, on roads clogged with refugees and retreating units. The staff moved 4,500 tons of ammunition per day to the attacking divisions, distributed 57 tons of maps to units whose sectors had completely changed, and strung 20,000 miles of communications wire to maintain contact across the rapidly shifting front. Support echelons carried 63,000 tons of supplies in 5 days to sustain the advance. Meanwhile, quick-thinking quartermaster troops raced to evacuate over 3 million gallons of fuel from depots near Spa and Stavelot, denying this critical resource to the advancing Germans. When Peiper's tanks approached the massive fuel dump at Francorchamps containing over 2 million gallons, American soldiers had already moved most of it to safety. By December 22, Kampfgruppe Peiper had virtually no fuel. A Luftwaffe aerial resupply attempt failed when most of the canisters fell into American hands. The commander, Joachim Peiper, was forced to abandon his remaining vehicles and walk back to German lines through the forest with just 800 survivors of his original 4,800 men. At Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne received its first major airdrop on December 23rd when the weather finally cleared. 241 planes dropped 144 tons in 4 hours. Total air resupply delivered over 1,000 tons by parachute and over 90 tons by glider, with a success rate exceeding 90%. The defenders held until Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through on December 26th. Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee's communications zone redirected massive quantities of ammunition and fuel to counterattacking forces within days. The Germans had nothing comparable. The offensive failed not because of American fighting spirit, though that was considerable. It failed because the German logistics system could not sustain a major offensive, while the American system could pivot an entire army within days. The foundations of this American advantage had been laid years before the first soldier landed in France. The Victory Program of 1941, prepared by Major Albert C. Wedemeyer, who had attended the German War College in Berlin from 1936 to 1938, estimated the United States would need 215 divisions, comprising 8.8 million men to defeat the Axis powers. The War Production Board under Donald M. Nelson supervised over $180 billion in weapons production, coordinating thousands of factories and millions of workers. William S. Knudsen, Danish-born president of General Motors who received a direct commission as lieutenant general, the only civilian in American history to enter the army at that rank, oversaw aircraft production growth from fewer than 3,000 planes in 1939 to nearly 300,000 by war's end. His verdict was simple. We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible. The build-up in Britain before D-Day, codenamed Operation Bolero, stockpiled the supplies that would sustain the invasion. By June 1944, over 1.5 million American troops were stationed in the United Kingdom. Vast storage depots spread across southern England held 2.5 million tons of stockpiled supplies. The Americans shipped hundreds of locomotives and thousands of freight cars across the Atlantic to ensure the railways could handle the load. British citizens joked that only the barrage balloons were keeping the island from sinking under the weight of American equipment. The scale of preparations defied imagination. Tens of thousands of vehicles were waterproofed for the beach landings. Millions of K-rations were packed and staged. Medical supplies, sufficient for 100,000 casualties, were positioned in forward aid stations. Ammunition dumps stretched across the English countryside. Fuel storage facilities held hundreds of millions of gallons of gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. Engineer units stockpiled bridging equipment, road-building materials, and construction supplies. Signal Corps prepared thousands of miles of telephone wire, hundreds of radio sets, and elaborate communications plans. Every division, every regiment, every battalion received its assigned loading priority, its designated ship, its precise landing time and location. When the invasion finally came, the logistics achievements matched the combat ones. By June 30th, 1944, 24 days after D-Day, 850,279 men, 148,803 vehicles, and 570,505 tons of supplies had been landed on the Normandy beaches. These numbers exceeded even the most optimistic planning estimates. The Great Storm of June 19th to 22nd, 1944, and the worst Channel storm in 40 years, destroyed Mulberry A, the American artificial harbor at Omaha Beach. 21 of 28 Phoenix caissons were wrecked. 800 craft of all types were damaged or destroyed. Eisenhower confirmed on June 29th that no attempt would be made to rebuild it, but the American supply officers simply shifted to open beach operations. By June 23rd, both American beaches exceeded their previous discharge rates. Omaha Beach processed 13,500 tons per day, 115% of planned capacity. Utah Beach handled 7,000 tons per day, 124% of planned capacity. The system bent but did not break. When Cherbourg fell on June 26th through 29th, the Germans had demolished the port so thoroughly that Colonel Alvin G. Viney called it the most complete, intensive, and best-planned demolition in history. Every crane was destroyed. Every warehouse was booby-trapped. The harbor was filled with sunken ships and mines. Hitler awarded the Knight's Cross to Rear Admiral Henniker for the destruction. Yet, American engineers had the port operational within weeks. First deep-draft cargo ships entered the outer harbor on July 16th. By September, Cherbourg handled over 25,000 tons per day, compared to its peacetime capacity of 800 tons. The Germans had done their worst, and it had not been enough. The capture of Antwerp on September 4, 1944, offered even greater potential. The British 11th Armoured Division seized the port with its facilities virtually intact thanks to the Belgian resistance and its White Brigade, who prevented the Germans from carrying out demolitions. But the 55-mile Scheldt estuary leading to the sea remained in German hands. Montgomery's decision to prioritize Operation Market Garden over clearing the Scheldt, a choice he later admitted was a bad mistake, delayed the port's opening until November 28th, when the Canadian-built freighter Fort Cataraqui became the first Allied heavy cargo ship to enter. Once operational, Antwerp transformed the supply situation. Its capacity of over 40,000 tons per day, from 10 square miles of docks and 20 miles of water frontage, could supply 54 divisions, compared to Cherbourg's 21. Between November 1944 and April 1945, 2.5 million tons of supplies flowed through the port. The Germans responded with a sustained V-weapon bombardment lasting 175 days, from October 1944 to March 1945. Over 4,248 V-1s and 1,712 V-2s struck Greater Antwerp. The Cinema Rex disaster, on December 16, 1944, a V-2 direct hit on a crowded theatre, killed 567 people, including 296 Allied servicemen. It took 6 days to recover all bodies, many found sitting upright in their seats, yet the port never closed. The dock workers, Belgian and American alike, kept unloading ships while the rockets fell around them. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 demonstrated the final evolution of American logistics capability. On March 7th, troops of the 9th Armored Division found the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still standing, one of the last remaining Rhine bridges in Allied reach. German demolition charges, made with weak civilian-grade explosives called Donnerite instead of military-grade materials, damaged but failed to destroy it. Within days, over 25,000 troops crossed the Ludendorff Bridge itself before it collapsed on March 17th, killing 28 engineers working to reinforce it. By then, combat engineers had already built pontoon and treadway bridges, expanding the bridgehead to over 125,000 men. Montgomery's Operation Plunder, which crossed the Rhine from March 23rd to 27th, rivaled D-Day in scale. Over 1 million troops participated. More than 4,000 artillery pieces provided fire support. Engineering resources included thousands of engineers with tens of thousands of tons of assault bridging, 25,000 wooden pontoons, and 2,000 assault boats. The 17th Armoured Engineer Battalion set a record during this operation, constructing an 1,152-foot treadway bridge in just 6 hours and 15 minutes. By March 28th, the American 9th Army had 12 bridges spanning the Rhine. The final barrier to Germany had been breached. The men who built these bridges and drove these trucks have largely passed into history. Lieutenant Colonel David E. Pergrin commanded the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, which earned a presidential citation for the Battle of the Bulge, built the first pontoon bridge at Remagen, and discovered 17 survivors of the Malmedy massacre. The battalion's record included 23 timber bridges, 44 Bailey bridges, 7 treadway bridges, 11 bridges under fire, 7,000 mines cleared, and 8,500 German prisoners taken, all from approximately 600 men. Major Charity Adams commanded the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, the only all-African-American Women's Army Corps unit to serve overseas. Stationed in Birmingham, England, and then Rouen, France, each shift processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail, maintaining the connection between soldiers and home that sustained morale across the theatre. Her unit cleared a 6-month backlog of mail in just 3 months. James D. Rookard of Company C, 514th Quartermaster Regiment, was 19 years old when he drove for the Red Ball. He came from Maple Heights, Ohio. "We hauled anything General Patton needed," he remembered. There were dead bodies and dead horses on the highways after bombs dropped. Washington, rector of the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company, recalled the segregation they endured. "You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites. Yet they drove anyway. They drove through the night, through enemy territory, through roads cratered by bombs and littered with the wreckage of war. An armored division commander observed them under fire and said, 'They delivered gas under constant fire. Damned if I would want their job. They have what it takes.'" The German officers who testified after the war understood what had defeated them. A saying widely attributed to General Heinz Guderian, the pioneer of German armored warfare, captured the fundamental truth. Logistics is the ball and chain of armored warfare. The Americans had forged their chain from an endless supply of steel, while Germany's links broke one by one. Field Marshal Walter Model issued an edict to all Army Group B commanders declaring, "Enemy number 1 is the enemy air force, which, because of its absolute superiority, tries to destroy our spearheads." Vice Admiral Friedrich Rüge, Rommel's naval aide, called Allied air power the modern type of warfare, turning the flank not from the side but from above. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein of Panzer Lehr Division described Operation Cobra's bombing in stark terms. The whole bombed area was transformed into fields covered with craters, in which no human being was alive. Tanks and guns were destroyed and overturned, and could not be recovered. The Air Effects Committee's comprehensive finding, assembled from hundreds of German officer testimonies, stated the conclusion plainly. From the high command to the soldier in the field, German opinion has been agreed that air power was the most striking aspect of Allied superiority. But air power required fuel. It required ammunition. It required spare parts and maintenance crews and forward airfields constructed by engineering battalions. In other words, it required the logistics system that delivered 412,000 tons through the Red Ball Express and 2.5 million tons through Antwerp. The debate between Eisenhower and Montgomery over strategy in September 1944 illustrated how completely logistics governed military options. Montgomery advocated concentrating all resources into a single narrow thrust northeast toward the Ruhr. Eisenhower championed a broad front, advancing along a 300-mile line. At a tense September 10th meeting at Brussels Airport, Montgomery described Eisenhower's telegrams as nothing but balls, sheer balls, rubbish. Eisenhower responded quietly but firmly. "Steady, Monty. You cannot speak to me like that. I am your boss." The logisticians had already settled the argument. SHAEF calculations showed that only 12 divisions could have been supported in a rapid advance, far fewer than the 40 Montgomery requested. Only 3 divisions could have been sustained as far as Berlin. Historian Martin van Creveld concluded that the question as to whether Montgomery's plan presented a real alternative to Eisenhower's strategy must be answered in the negative. Today, the physical remains of this massive effort still dot the landscape of Western Europe. At Arromanches in France, the concrete caissons of Mulberry Bey, the British artificial harbour that operated for 10 months, still stand in the waters off Gold Beach, silent monuments to the engineering that made the invasion possible. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans maintains exhibits honouring the Red Ball Express. The Transportation Museum at Fort Lee, Virginia, preserves the memory of the truck drivers who kept the armies moving. The Liberty ships that carried supplies across the Atlantic have almost entirely vanished, their steel recycled in the post-war years. But their legacy endures in the records of their construction. 2,710 vessels, built by 18 American shipyards, each capable of carrying 10,000 long tons of cargo, equivalent to 2,840 jeeps or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition. Average construction time dropped from 244 days for the first ship to an average of 42 days by 1943. The world record belonged to the SS Robert E. Peary, completed at Permanente Metals Corporation in Richmond, California, in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes in November 1942. Henry Kaiser, who had never built a ship before the war, revolutionized the industry with modular prefabrication and welding instead of riveting. His methods allowed workers with minimal training to assemble pre-built sections into complete vessels in record time. His 7 shipyards produced over 1,400 vessels, 27% of all maritime commission orders. In 1943, 3 Liberty ships were being completed daily across all American yards. A 1945 poll named Kaiser the civilian who did most to help win the war, ahead of industrialists, scientists, and politicians alike. His story embodied the American approach to the war. Find a problem, solve it with industrial innovation, and scale the solution until it overwhelmed the enemy. The secret pipeline that ran under the English Channel, codenamed Operation Pluto for pipelines under the ocean, delivered approximately 180 million imperial gallons of fuel to Allied forces, about 8% of all petroleum shipped from the United Kingdom. Engineers laid 17 pipelines that eventually stretched from Dungeness to Boulogne, pumping 1 million gallons per day by March 1945. The Germans never knew the pipelines existed until after the war. They had been searching for fuel dumps to bomb while the fuel flowed invisibly beneath the waves. The numbers, taken together, tell the story of a war won by production as much as by combat. American truck production alone outpaced total German vehicle production by 15-1. The United States manufactured more trucks in a single year than Germany produced in the entire war. After D-Day, American engineers built or rebuilt thousands of miles of roads and railways across France and into Germany. Where they found destruction, they created infrastructure. Where they found chaos, they created order. Less than 1/4 of Allied troops in France served in combat roles. The rest drove trucks, unloaded ships, built bridges, repaired vehicles, operated hospitals, processed mail, cooked food, and performed the 1,000 other tasks that kept an army of millions functioning across a continent. The ratio of service troops to combat troops reflected a fundamental truth about modern mechanized warfare. For every rifleman at the front, there were 4 or 5 soldiers behind him, keeping him supplied, fed, armed, and moving. The infantry might win the battles, but the quartermasters won the war. German officers understood this intellectually, but they never had the industrial capacity to match it in practice. Their armies remained dependent on horses and captured equipment, while American factories poured out an endless stream of standardized trucks, jeeps, and spare parts. The human cost of this logistics effort was significant, though often overlooked. Truck drivers died in accidents on crowded roads. Stevedores were crushed by shifting cargo. Engineers were killed building bridges under fire. Ammunition handlers died in depot explosions. These casualties rarely made headlines, but they were as much victims of the war as any infantryman who fell in combat. When that anonymous German prisoner watched the Red Ball trucks roll past and declared that Americans had piled up the supplies and let them fall on us, he was describing something that military theorists had understood for centuries, but that his own country had failed to grasp. Armies do not fight on courage alone. They fight on beans and bullets, on fuel and medicine, on spare parts and replacement weapons. Cut off those supplies, and even the bravest soldiers become helpless. The United States never let its supplies be cut off. Not at Normandy, not during the breakout, not at the Bulge, not at the Rhine. The trucks kept rolling, the ships kept landing, the supplies kept flowing. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Field Marshal Rommel, General von Mellenthin, and dozens of other German commanders all reached the same conclusion in their own ways. They had been defeated not by an army but by a system that could produce more trucks than Germany produced all vehicles combined. A system that could lose a harbour to a storm and replace it with open beach operations within days. A system that could turn an entire army 90 degrees and relieve a besieged garrison within 3 days of receiving orders. General Adolf Galland, Germany's general of fighters, stated simply, from the very first moment of the invasion, the Allies had absolute air supremacy. That supremacy rested on fuel that flowed through pipelines under the Channel, on ammunition that crossed the Atlantic in Liberty ships built at impossible speed, on spare parts and bombs and rockets delivered by truck drivers who had not slept in 2 days. The young men who drove those trucks, who built those bridges, who unloaded those ships, did not receive the glory that went to tank commanders and fighter pilots. Many of them, particularly the African-American soldiers who made up 3/4 of the Red Ball Express, came home to a country that still denied them basic civil rights. It would take decades for their contribution to receive the recognition it deserved. But the German officers who faced them knew the truth from bitter experience. They had watched their fuel run out, their railways destroyed, their reinforcements bombed into oblivion before they could reach the front. They had seen the endless columns of American trucks rolling toward them, day after day, week after week, month after month, an unbroken stream of olive-drab vehicles that never stopped coming, until there was nothing left to do but surrender. The Americans called it logistics. The Germans called it Materialschlacht. The soldiers who drove the trucks called it the Red Ball Express. Whatever name it carried, it was the force that won the war.